Out in a small town in Canada named Garson, one man working by himself at the nearby mine would have quite the terrifying encounter. A spherical ship would nearly crash into the ground in front of him before gently landing. Giant insect-like creatures that emerged from within and ordered him to do something so terrible that he would never repeat it to a single person. After refusing to go through with this order, he became so frightened that they would come back for him that he considered being locked up in jail for his own safety. Now, with declassified files, we know that one mysterious researcher working with Project Blue Book believed that it could have something to do with the mineral mine there, and possibly even the end of the world. This incident, said to be the first of its kind in Canada, was all witnessed by a young miner, Ennio Lasarza. Known to be a bit of a hermit, he lived in a small shack by himself and walked everywhere because he didn't even own a car. It seems that he was an Italian immigrant and was about 23 at the time of this story. It was July 2nd in 1954, and Lasarza was working at a large nickel mine out in Garson, Ontario. This tiny town is located about 5 miles from Sudbury and roughly 310 miles north of Toronto. On an interesting note, this was also only 150 miles away from Canada's Flying Saucer Research Observatory. On this day, Lasarza was tasked with a painting job outside the mine. At about 5 p.m., something in the sky caught his attention, and to his surprise, he would notice an object falling to the earth at an incredible speed. To him, it appeared to be going several times the speed of a jet plane. He was sure it was going to crash in front of him, but as it got lower, it suddenly slowed and hovered just above the ground. This hovering object was spherical in shape and was about 25 feet in diameter, and along the center were what appeared to be several portholes or at least something similar. The top of the sphere had a square with a telescopic projection, which he thought looked a lot like a retractable antenna. Some sort of landing gear extended from the object as it grew closer to the ground, with the grass beneath it starting to appear scorched. Lasarza would look around to see if anybody else had witnessed this, but he was all alone. Looking back at the craft, he would see 3 very bizarre creatures emerging from within. A platform lowered to the ground, and they looked to be coming down some kind of invisible staircase. They were all around 13 feet tall and glowed a greenish-blue color, and to him they looked very similar to insects. Each one had 3 arms and 3 legs, which, unlike the rest of the body, seemed to be covered in thick hair. The 6 hands were strange as well, looking to be crab-like claws which open and close spasmodically. The heads of these creatures were also bizarre, looking to have 2 spur-like antennae protruding out of the very top. He thought that it might be some kind of helmet, but he wasn't completely sure. The faces of these beings were almost mesmerizing to Lasarza. In the center of the forehead area was just one large eye, which was surrounded by a color combination which he had never seen before. He was quite terrified at this point and started to instinctively back away from the whole scene. But as he did so, one of the creatures began to scuttle towards him. He turned to run, but didn't take more than a few steps before the creature looked at him with a sort of hypnotic stare that gave him a psychic blow and froze him in his tracks. Lasarza said that it then began to speak to him, but it seemed strange, almost as if the voice was inside his head. They would first show him images of humanity's future, in which he would see horrific scenes of which he would refuse to describe. It was then that he was sternly ordered to do something so awful that Lasarza would never dare to speak about it aloud. He said that he made it clear to the terrifying beings that he would rather die than do what they asked of him. Right after this, he would pass out from what he claimed to be fright and strain. He later told the press, "They fixed me with a hypnotic stare until I fainted." At some point after this, he woke up and quickly found some of his co-workers who would help him over the first aid station. One of these co-workers later said, "He was white as a ghost and passed out when we got to the station." When Lasarza came back to, he told the other man about the events leading up to this. That man quickly called the local police, as well as the Royal Canadian Air Force radio station investigators. After telling the story to the investigators, it was easy to see how terrified Lasarza actually was. He had grown so paranoid after disobeying the large insect-like creatures that he was considering drastic measures. Thinking that they may come back for him, he wanted to ask the authorities to lock him up in jail, but wasn't sure that even that would keep him safe. Corporal Bill Cook would conduct an investigation into the report, but it didn't seem like anything ever came from it. He would also be asked if he thought Lasarza should go to the hospital and be checked out, but he didn't think so, saying that he had actually returned to work and finished off his shift right after regaining consciousness. Corporal Cook would add, "Lasarza is in his 20s, and there didn't seem to be too much the matter with him when we spoke to him." When articles were first published on this topic, many would quote Lasarza as saying that the spacecraft had come from Mars. However, when later asked about this, he would deny that part of the story and said that he had no idea where those creatures had actually come from. It seems that Mars was very close to Earth at that time, and many news stories were exaggerating details or trying to mix in entirely different incidents to try to make it a more interesting topic. Soon, the RCAF would be contacted with the man who conducted their investigation, Squadron Leader King, making a statement. He oddly said, "I actually found it to be fictitious. It just didn't corroborate with anything of what it should be." But when he was asked about what exactly it should be, King would answer with, "That is classified information." Although he wouldn't discuss the topic any further, it was still an interesting statement. This gives the impression that he thinks the encounter is fake based on what he's seen at other locations, possibly other landing sites. Several days after this, a New York minister, who also had a radio show that would discuss many UFO and abduction incidents, would hear of this encounter up in Canada. This man, Charles Beck, was well known in the UFO research scene back in the 50s and even had various interviews with government officials on these topics. Becoming quite interested in Lasarza's case, he quickly made his way out to Garson, arriving on July 9th, just 1 week after the whole incident. Although mining management wouldn't let him on the property to inspect the landing spot, he was able to have a 4-hour interview with Lasarza. Beck, with the help of a reporter, Michael Bolton from Sudbury Daily Star, would take a tape recording of the whole conversation. After careful questioning, Beck would come to realize that Lasarza did not know of other famous UFO reports and didn't even watch or read science fiction material. It actually seems that he was confused by the term flying saucer and didn't know what Beck was even referring to. Lasarza told them the whole story, but right after they were finishing up, he remembered that he had made certain promises to the police and the RCAF. He was suddenly worried that if the tape came out, he would get in trouble with one of these organizations and possibly face deportation. Lasarza then begged Beck to erase the tape, who complied and destroyed the recording right in front of him. Lasarza told him that he may be considered crazy, but he wouldn't retract his story. He just didn't want to get in trouble with the tape. Beck would try one more time to get him to say what the aliens wanted with him, but he still refused to say, commenting that out of the whole encounter, that was the most disturbing part. But Beck didn't think he was crazy at all, saying that he was actually impressed by him being so level-headed and intelligent during the interview. After this, Beck did his best to remember every detail he could and began to make his way back to New York. News of the encounter would quickly spread across the local community, with many calling these entities the monsters. Some women in Garson were even stating that they didn't feel safe going out in the area at night anymore. As the story was passed around, new details would seem to be added, such as the craft breaking branches off trees as it flew down to the ground. The police would then be asked about this, but they would say that there were no broken branches. They would also add that they didn't have any evidence of scorch marks left in the grass either. Soon, Lasarza was becoming worried that he may be institutionalized, with his co-workers and other local officials beginning to question his sanity. At some point, he would even meet up with at least one psychiatrist from Toronto, but unfortunately no information on this meetup seems to be out there. Meanwhile, Beck had written down all of the details he could remember and went back on the radio to discuss what he had seen while he was out there.
So a couple of days later, I got kind of interested. There was no more follow-up in the paper. I drove out and went up the old Garson Road and around, and I'm looking at this mound, and here's a big U.S. twin helicopter. I'm not familiar with makes of helicopters. It was a twin-bladed job. It must have had 50 personnel on it. They had driven steel metal poles at about 25 foot distance between each other over this whole mound area, and they posted signs on every second post saying, "No trespassing, you will be prosecuted. USL military." I did see 5-6 men at one time with Geiger counters, earmuffs on, going over the top of the soil. I did not see any digging, but I thought to myself at this time, if there's any truth in this story, this kind of confirms that this guy was telling the truth, because why would USA military come from the States and be examining this soil for about a week? I went back out a week later after that one excursion out there. Everything was taken down, signs were taken down, everything was back to normal. I walked around there, I didn't see anything unusual, and that was it. They'd packed up and left. They claim, I only heard through the grapevine, working at Inco at Coppercliff myself, that this man was a basket case, and I can't say if he was or not, that they had taken him to North Bay, and psychiatrists were examining him. And again, I feel that this was a cover-up. Maybe they told him to keep his mouth shut, because at that time they didn't want anything about UFOs to leak out. So I feel that they either took him away and he wouldn't shut up and they kept him down there, or they threatened him and released him and let him go back to work. I have not got in touch with Garson people to know which way that this story has ended up.
After all of this, Beck felt that he must have been telling the truth, adding, "Lasarza is regarded in his community as a model citizen with a good record, who had and has nothing whatever to gain by bringing down on his head the pitiless glare of publicity of an unfavorable kind." Many wonder why they wouldn't allow Beck to access the site if there really wasn't anything to hide. When researching this case, most of the information out there really comes from just one declassified Project Blue Book document, which could explain the military presence he saw there. And although Project Blue Book didn't research this case directly, an organization they worked with would. It's not mentioned in the files which organization investigated this, with the author just being labeled as Associate ESS. However, this author would have several comments after investigating the case. First, ESS wanted to know whether these space beings really looked the way Lasarza described them, wondering if they somehow took this form for an unknown reason. But if they really did look that way, then they must have been some kind of advanced insect life from another planet, whether that be in our solar system or another. The author would also add that based on how the creatures acted around Lasarza, they weren't sure if they were friendly or not, writing, "It would seem that their intentions were not benign." Second, and possibly more importantly, ESS also really wanted to know what the space beings wanted Lasarza to do for them. Since he never did tell a soul what they actually said to him, the author decided to speculate on what they might be doing here. He started off by questioning why the creatures would want to be at a nickel mine, and why they would be interested in an employee working there. He believes it might have something to do with the nickel itself, and the element that appears right next to it on the periodic table, cobalt. They would then add that 26% of natural nickel consists of the isotope nickel-60. If this isotope is bombarded with neutrons, the nickel will spit out a proton and become cobalt-60, which could be on par or even superior to radium in terms of radioactive potency. They would say that just a spoonful of cobalt-60 would be equal to all of the radium ever produced in the world at that time. ESS speculates that a technologically advanced species may have the means to turn all of the nickel-60 in the mine to cobalt-60 with just one chain reaction. Although we don't know how to make this chain reaction begin, they might, with ESS writing, "However, this little difficulty might well be child's play to space being science, and they may have a neutron-generating fuse gadget that could change a mine full of nickel into cobalt-60. They also wonder if they wanted Lasarza to be the one to go inside the mine and set off this device for them. Perhaps they wanted to avoid doing it themselves because they knew the one to set it off would be exposed to large amounts of radiation." The author continues, wondering if the space beings gave up after Lasarza fainted, or if they went to try again, to try to find someone else in a different mine who would comply more easily. And there was a reason to be so worried about cobalt-60 at this time, because back in 1950, a bomb made of the stuff would first be described by physicist Leos Lazard. He would call it the, quote, doomsday device, believing that an arsenal of these bombs could wipe out all life on our planet. The cobalt-60 bomb would end up being heavily researched by the United States Air Force, but thankfully never deployed. ESS would go on their writing, describing how much destruction they think would take place from an underground reaction of that much cobalt. He thought it could cause great earthquakes and tsunamis across the planet, and if that didn't wipe out all of humanity, then the atmospheric contamination very well could. He wanted to know if maybe these were some kind of space guardians that came to kill off humans because of our recent atomic experiments in order to save the planet. ESS would end the report by writing, "From their viewpoint, this might amount to killing off the pupils to save the school." And if the above sounds like science fiction, let me leave you with the thought that actual events bearing on and related to the coming of saucers are and will be far stranger than any fiction ever written. Although for a while no one knew who made this report, other declassified files would come out showing the same author associate ESS. They would be discovered to be a man by the name of Edward S. Schultz, who would then be linked to the publication Round Robin and then the Borderland Science Research Foundation, or BSRF. This foundation would describe themselves as California Nonprofit Research and Education Organization, founded in 1951 by Maid Lane for the purpose of studying parapsychology and extended consciousness. It has since expanded in scope to traverse as broad a path of the grand terrain of the borderland as may be uncovered by human perceptions, and perhaps even further. BSRF is also said by others to have risen from post-war New Age thinkers and early UFO magazine researchers. And although the Foundation tended to work with the idea that their research was being repressed by traditional science, others outside this organization didn't quite feel this way. Many felt that they were really just peddling pseudoscience, with some members even trying to predict different natural disasters. After many of these reports began circulating, the local Garson community would be significantly impacted. The economy of the town would be hurt more than anything. The nickel mine was the main industry of the area, and with Lasarza's encounter quickly becoming very well known, many people stopped showing up for work. Many of the miners were quite afraid of going out to the site, and even some shop owners in town began to close down at nighttime. But in the long term, the encounter also had a positive impact on tourism in the area as well. With more and more media companies showing up, the story began to spread across Canada as well as the US. Soon many people were coming out to Garson in an attempt to maybe see something or even have an encounter of their own. Local businesses like hotels and restaurants boomed in the town for quite some time, and even began selling souvenirs like t-shirts and keychains related to the Lasarza encounter. This all lasted for quite a while before tourists eventually stopped coming in and the story was slowly forgotten by a good majority of people. In more recent years, with the release of these declassified files, the investigations out in Garson were more or less brought back from the dead. Many researchers were fascinated by this case, with several different groups going out to Garson to investigate for themselves. In 2018, a team of researchers from a Canadian university would come out to the town and were said to have performed a very thorough investigation into the incident. They would look over the scene, as well as all of the witness testimony and government documents that they could get a hold of. In the end, they would conclude that it most likely was the misidentification of a natural phenomena. Another team of cryptozoologists would go out to Garson in 2021 in search of more details involving this case. They would interview several locals who claimed to have witnessed some of these invaders themselves, as well as search the landing area. But in the end, they never came up with any new details involving the original encounter. But even so, these bizarre creatures continue to live on in pop culture. Over the year, Lasarza's story would become the inspiration behind many books, movies, and TV shows. UFO enthusiasts would also keep it alive, with many even now speculating at the origins of these insect-like aliens. With all that said, though, the story never completely died out in the Garson folklore either, with many residents making their own sightings throughout the decades. Some locals even related the creatures to other supernatural phenomena in the region, like the Sudbury Wolves, a supernatural creature said to live in the forest around Sudbury. Even now, the Garson residents claim to occasionally see lights in the sky, or even to have encountered these strange creatures. But most of these reports have never been investigated, and many have trouble believing them to begin with. Witnesses say that the Garson invaders are hostile or at least aggressive towards humans. Some have said they were chased through the woods by these strange creatures, and others have even claimed to have been attacked. And although none of them seem to be physically harmed, many of them would say that the insect-like creatures would emit a strange, loud screeching sound that would cause physical discomfort. There really never was an expert analysis of the Garson invaders either. Nowadays, we also see 1954 as a year of very high UFO activity. There were heavy concentrations of landings in France, Italy, and South America. Jacques Vallée himself was also known to have investigated and studied over 200 of these UFO cases just that year. With no photos or physical evidence of Lasarza's encounter, many believe that there just wasn't enough interest in the incident back at that time. But now it's been so long since then, it's almost impossible to investigate the case any further. At this point, it's unclear what the creature's true motivations were or why they seemed to attack humans. Some speculate that they were aliens after resources in the mine, while others think that they were really just a kind of cryptid species trying to protect its territory. And in the end, all we can really do is speculate on the whole incident, as it's just unclear to many if it was a hoax, a misidentification of natural phenomenon, or a genuine encounter. There is just no hard proof of anything, and it's sad to say, but there likely never will be. Now, it's been over 70 years since this encounter, and it seems that Lasarza himself would never go on to seek money or fame from any of this after his story gained popularity. It also doesn't seem he ever talked about it again publicly either, with Beck's memory of the interview and BSRF's report practically the only information about the encounter even out there. Really, nothing else is even known about Lasarza. If he is still alive, he would be in his mid-90s by now. But even if he isn't, he lives on in the story of his encounter, which I'm sure will continue to be passed on for many more years. Thanks for watching my video, everyone. Please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content. Be sure to leave a comment too, I'm always interested in what you guys think about these topics as well. The telepathic messages in this case do remind me quite a bit of the Filiberto Cardenas case, so be sure to check out my video on that if you haven't seen it. And this show is available in audio form too, so if you're interested in that, it's available on most podcast platforms. For anyone that wants to show their support, I do have a Patreon and a channel membership up where you can get videos early and ad-free. And a big thanks and shout out to my first Patreon supporter. This was Matt, and I want to believe.